No. Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for our fourth and final seminar in Teaching Excellence for the semester. Today's topic is facilitating civil group discussions in the classroom. My name is Kelly Smith. I'm the director of the CFE, and it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Epley Sanders. Dr. Epley Sanders is an associate professor of political science and the political science program coordinator here at TAMU-CC. Dr. Epley Sanders joined the TAMU-CC faculty in 2010, and her areas of research include comparative government and politics with an emphasis on religion and gender, democracy, and research methodology. She has lived and worked abroad with experience that include a Fulbright fellowship in short-term consulting for the World Bank. Dr. Epley Sanders also conducts research and publishes articles on the scholarship of teaching and learning, and we are very fortunate to have her with us today to share her expertise. Let's please welcome Dr. Epley Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you all for coming today. I know there's a lot going on, and we are speeding towards the finish line for the end of finals in the semester. So I do appreciate you coming. Many of this afternoon's topics related to civil group discussions will apply in multiple settings on and off campus. But being mindful of our time constraints today, I'm going to primarily focus on civil group discussions in our classroom setting. So this will apply in other areas too, just keeping that in the back of your mind. If my hold on, just making sure this will work. It's a recording mic, not a regular mic. I thought it was technical. Oh, there it is. Okay. So if you happen to know me, you definitely will know that I'm a dog person. My students know this about me as well. And not that long ago, I had a funny scenario on the phone where I had called up and said, could you fit my dog Pluto in for the groomer schedule next week? And the doggy daycare place said, is he the talkative one, right? And I said, yes, that's him. And so I say that because I am quite talkative, and you'll see already in the PowerPoint handouts, like I've got a lot to say in a short amount of time. So I hope you'll bear with me, but I'm happy to answer questions after the presentation or in the coming weeks or months. But I thought this would be a humorous way to say, yeah, there's going to be a lot that I pack in today. All right. So the word civil, if we're going back to basics for definitions, has political and legal aspects to it. And Merriam-Webster dictionary mentions words like citizens, courtesy and politeness, or being mannerly, as well as law. Now, other definitions and sources that discuss the etymology of the term civil will also mention things like, quote, good citizenship and, quote, orderly behavior. And so in this way, we're concerned with the individual and the group, hence our classroom settings, right? Because there's individual processes going on, but also group processes going on when we have discussions. Now, for pedagogical and practical reasons, we as faculty tend to think of civility, right, in our classrooms is where students discuss topics in respectful ways and that they are positively learning from each other. The learning environment doesn't have to be easy, though, right? So we're not saying it's easy, we're not saying that it's free from conflict, but a major goal in having a civil group discussion is to have students avoid the dangers and chaos of things like name-calling, finger-pointing, physical altercations, discriminatory actions, and other hurtful and problematic behaviors. Now, some of you may be very fortunate and have not experienced any of that in your classrooms, For better or for worse, in political science, we encounter that quite a bit, given the topics that we cover. There are many ways to define and describe civil group discussions, but for the purposes of today's presentation, I selected one model that comes from American University, and I think it's relatively straightforward, and you can build upon it depending on your classroom needs. The institution there lists 5 characteristics for what civil discourse is and 4 things that it's not. So for example, civil discourse, according to American University, is truthful, productive, audience-based, it's about listening and talking, and each speaker's own responsibility, whereas civil discourse is not just mere politeness, an exercise in martyrdom, about telling other people who they are, and purely performative. In my own discipline of political science, we might add evidence-based to civil discourse. So I strongly encourage you, if you're adding to this list, to make it specialized for your discipline so that they get not just a general understanding of where you're coming from, but also the professional development aspect where they know, okay, my discipline understands civil discourse to include X, Y, and Z. You can formally include a list like this as part of your syllabus or as part of your dialogue guidelines if you have them. If you don't yet have dialogue guidelines, I encourage you to have some, and I'll provide an example in a few minutes. And there's packets on each of your tables that includes not just a copy of my slides, but also sample documents, and in the sample documents is a copy of dialogue guidelines that you can refer to. So, based on my own experiences, observations of and stories from other faculty members, as well as resources from the literature on the scholarship of teaching and learning, I've learned that there's certain foundations and structures that are key to facilitating successful and healthy civil group discussions. The select strategies and examples that I'm presenting today are not the only ones out there, though, okay? But I do hope the ideas that I am electing to focus on will guide your future thinking and planning and implementation. So the first strategy, one, is to model professionalism. And by this I mean to model and maintain respectful behavior throughout the whole semester. So I'm from the camp that believes that good leadership from a faculty member helps students learn and understand proper protocols and facilitates their professional development. Some might view this as a parental model. I still think of it as a scholarly teacher model, but I do think it's a lot with the instructor. And so that's why I try to remind folks, and myself too, to not be hypocritical. So don't expect students to act a certain way and then you do the opposite of that, whether that's a small thing or a larger thing. So first, modeling starts, I think, with having a clear, organized, and a contract type of syllabus with supporting materials as needed. So some key elements would, of course, be including all the expected university, college, program, and class rules and statements. You get these blurbs, at the beginning of each semester, typically, or each academic year, and incorporate those. I actually add a few more, right? So when it comes to accommodations or exceptions, I'll add some additional things on my syllabus along with those existing statements. I'm a big fan of including a contract at the end of the syllabus. The first page of the sample documents gives you a short example of what that contract might look like. Depending on classes, I either have to sign it and turn it in as a hard copy or uploaded in Blackboard as a PDF. To me, I use it as a great exercise in understanding and following the fine print, right? So sometimes students won't even read it. They'll sign it, submit it, and then there's a problem. They come to office hours, and then they have an uh-oh moment because I'm holding them accountable to the thing that they actually signed, right? I also think it's great if you can include supplemental documents and tasks I also give an example of something like the city plagiarism module and quiz. The student accounts have changed this past semester, so the instructions for how to do that are now a little bit different. So you have to tweak it if you do have your students complete it. But I find that my plagiarism numbers went way down after I required this formal element at the start of the semester. Some students finish it in 10 minutes, some take half an hour, but it's no more than 40 minutes to go through the module and take an easy quiz. But again, you're formalizing things, and it reduces, at least in my opinion, potential cheating. Now, with the syllabus itself, I think modeling professionalism involves contextualizing the syllabus, though. So in other words, it's important to explain the whys, not just the how of it. So I know sometimes what will happen is the first day of class, you give your syllabus, you just kind of expect students to read it and follow it, sign it, and you're done. But students, I think, do better if you set the tone and you explain to them why you have certain rules in place. So then later, when you're expecting them to follow other policies like your dialogue guidelines or certain assessments, they're already going to kind of get a sense of like, okay, this is why she's doing things. Now, an example of this is my email policy. I require that all students engage with me professionally in their emails, and so I explain to them, though, why. So I tell them the etiquette norms in my discipline. I also say it's a way to self-present yourself well, right, in front of the professor, and in case I have to forward their email on to somebody else. Okay, it makes them look good, it makes me look good at the same time. It's a way to prevent delays or mistakes because I teach just so many students, right? So it makes sense to them that I'll be responsive if they give me more information. I also explain that it's a way to interact with people based on my cultural background. So sometimes students aren't always aware of their audience, and so it's important for me that they understand that depending on who you're writing to or talking to, you may have to adjust, or in political science we call it code switching, right, as needed. And so I tell them that this is really great practice given my particular identity and background. And then last but not least, I explain to them that my email policy is there as a protection mechanism or a CYA, like a cover your butt kind of situation, for both the student and for me, right? And then I extend it and I say, okay, not only is this email policy expected for the faculty and the student, but also student to student. So that opens up a discussion about not being rude or abrasive or unprofessional once they start getting into group discussions and group projects or other group assessments. And so those types of little signals, starting at the beginning, start building those structures and foundations as you proceed. I mentioned the dialogue guidelines, and again, an example is in the sample document packet. I do encourage folks to include dialogue guidelines in your syllabus, review it with students at the start of the semester, and visit guidelines periodically throughout the semester too. So my 3 suggestions are, you could use the general list provided today. It comes from my alma mater, the University of Michigan. There's about 8 rules there that you can use and talk with students about. You could use that general list and then revise it generated on each class, like with the revisions. So what I often do is the students will look at that part of the syllabus and then I'll have them add. So it might be like 1A or 1AB. Most of my students, most classes I would say, add like a little subset that says don't interrupt. Right? Apparently that's like one of their biggest pet peeves, right? So they'll add a section, and so because they've helped build those dialogue guidelines together, they're more likely to follow them. You could also create a new, brand spanking new organic list generated from each class. So start from scratch and say, what are the rules? I find the third one, while ideal, is probably best suited for your majors classes because they've had more experiences. I've had less luck with a new organic list with my freshman or sophomore classes. They just don't, either they don't care initially or they don't understand the value of it or they don't have enough experience, particularly as first semester freshmen, to know what you might want to include in there. So, you know, probe your students in the sense of that discussion of what would they like to have on that list. And you'll be surprised, students will open up pretty quickly about the negative experiences they've had in their classes with individuals or with groups. They'll definitely tell you what they've been unhappy with. And as a side note, unfortunately, they also have reported to me that faculty members don't always follow the dialogue guidelines that they've presented. So just as a hint, be on the lookout for that. So for example, if the group has decided to avoid interruptions, unless somebody is saying something really seriously negatively egregious, let them finish their statement as the instructor before interrupting them, for instance, because again, that goes back to avoiding the hypocritical behavior. Now, a few notes about trigger warnings, which you may or may not have heard about. Trigger warnings are also called disclaimers or classroom disclaimers. They're basically advance notice that the content that's about to be discussed, viewed, or read may elicit certain emotional reactions or bring up difficult memories. And those warnings, the trigger warnings or disclaimers, they could be presented verbally from the instructor as text on an assignment or in your slides, or as a symbol of some kind. So I've seen some folks, for instance, on their syllabus, they might highlight or have a particular symbol by difficult readings or assessments, so students might get a heads up. Now, I do have to say that there are ongoing debates about the pros and cons of using trigger warnings. So I encourage you to read more about trigger warnings online. There's loads of posts and articles and research, and talk with others to best determine your position on the use of trigger warnings. For my classes, I tend to include a brief discussion at the beginning of the semester about difficult topics that we're going to encounter. So for example, at the start of my international relations class, I just flat out say there's going to be very little to no fun, entertaining, or happy content. Right? I just put it out there, right? And it's a real downer. But I say that because there's literally no way I can sugarcoat war, environmental degradation, or inequalities, right? And that's my field, right? So, you know, unfortunately, literally every chapter of our textbook has conflict, injustice, you know, it's depressing, it's stressful. Much of the material the students have never even heard of. They had no idea the extent of just how terrible the world can be, right? And it's just slide after slide of statistics of just bad news, right? So I can't do a song and dance at the front of the class, and group work is not going to be fun. Like it just will not be fun, right? I don't know if it's comparable or less serious. Before, when I taught research methods, I had the same attitude, right? Like look, like, you know, these are tools that you're going to need. However, you just got to know going in, you know, there's no fun movies on statistics that I can show regarding this stuff. So what I do is I talk to students about how their emotional responses are typically, quote, normal, okay. So if they're angered by or sad or frustrated with the material, right, I let them know that that's appropriate, right? Like you should be shocked by genocide, right? Like you should be shocked by issues of climate change, right? And if you're not, that's a little weird, and we got to work through that part, right? But to process those emotions, I say, okay, look, you can use both on-campus and off-campus resources. So I provide opportunities and lists of resources so that they can identify, manage, and possibly resolve their emotions. So that might be talks during office hours, that might be personal counseling or academic success counseling at the counseling services office. It might be processing at the disability services office. It could be through student organizations, whether that's veterans or international student groups, for instance. It could be journaling, readings online, or just conversations with trusted people in their circles. But I go beyond just saying, yeah, this sucks, right? You want to give them a way to process it. Now, one thing, I don't know if you've noticed this recently, but I have started to experience an increasing number of students who are underprepared or equipped to deal with a lot of these kinds of things because they haven't been taught that before, they haven't had a lot of experience. So there may be times where, for better or for worse, you have to go into life coach mode, right, or counseling mode, which can sometimes be awkward for us to do, but now I'm seeing than just, in my case, the political science content, right? It goes beyond that. So just be aware of that particular component. So modeling professionalism, I think, also includes paying attention to verbal and nonverbal communication. And this process is relevant for faculty and student communications and student communications, right? So there are pros and cons of using different titles, honorifics, group terms, pronouns, and names. So when in doubt, ask the students, ask the class, ask other faculty members. And so, here are some examples of the kinds of things that you may want to be careful about and talk with students, not just in terms of how you refer to them, but also how do they refer to each other, right? So in my classes, my students during the first couple of weeks inevitably always think it's cheesy that I refer to their classmates as colleagues. So I'll say, turn to your colleague, partner up for a discussion, right? They think it's cheesy, but eventually the professionalism starts to kind of, sink in, and they understand why I'm doing that. So I am a fan of referring to students amongst themselves as colleagues, classmates, or scholars. If you use first names, last names, or nicknames, just ensure that you're pronouncing things correctly or as closely as possible to be respectful of their backgrounds. One thing I do like about Texas is the inclusive y'all, right? And so my students laugh because I don't have the Texas accent. They think it's a little silly and quaint, but I prefer it over things like you gals or you guys, right, for example. That's my students' preference with me. Because of my family's military background, I often easily slip into using sir and ma'am. Thus far, my students appreciate that, even when they want to use other pronouns or other gendered terms. But for some reason, at least my group of students in South Texas prefers when I say the sirs and ma'ams. And then you start to pick up that they use that with me, for instance. And so we have conversations about that. So find ways in which these kinds of verbal terms work for you and your students. Continuing on verbal and nonverbal communication, being mindful or careful of humor and jokes. Although I thought I was not that far removed in age from my students, apparently now that most of them are born in 2000 and beyond, I am very far away. And so a lot of the humor and jokes, and a particular word on sarcasm, for some professors that works really well because that's part of their teacher persona. For me, it always falls flat, and I've just given up. Like, I've just given up on that. And so those can go either in your favor or not. So just acknowledge, like, if you're not funny and you're not getting the response, like, just don't, Like, I did think I was funny, unfortunately, and I'm just not in class. So we just gave up on that. Remembering the importance of facial expressions, body language, and tone as well. So I didn't realize in my large lecture classes, students knew when I was excited about something, not based on my language or tone, but on my body language. And I had one intro class that actually took bets on my hand gestures that I found out afterwards. So at one point, so in my large lecture classes, I had two things. If a student made a really great comment, I would do an air high five because they're so far away, right? I can't do it. So I started to realize people were way more excited for the air high five than they should be. And then later I was told it was because they were betting on whether or not somebody in the class was going to get an air high five. And then the other one was, if a student asked a really good question, I should never play poker. If a student asked a good question, apparently I did this, and I was like, oh, this is great, right? And so again, erupted that section, and finally a kind soul told me what was going on, and I went with it, I laughed at it, and you know, we had a good time the rest of the semester. But keep in mind that your facial expressions, body language, like that plays a part in how you're communicating. And when you're facilitating civil group discussions, if you start to tense up or you start to make what my sister calls a stink face, right? Like they're going to know, right, if you're with them or against them in that situation. Also, if you, as the instructor or student, doesn't have an answer, it's perfectly okay to model the role of like taking time to research it and then get back to everyone at a later time. Just don't wait too long, okay? So an example of that is inevitably in each of my classes, I'll have that one student who treats my class like a quiz bowl or Jeopardy and is in some ways trying to challenge my authority, you know, and will be like, well, what happened, you know, in 1942 on December, you know, 10th? And I'll be like, I don't know, right? Like, okay, right? And you know, I think there's, for some students, it's genuine curiosity because something random pops into their heads. But there's others that are more intentional in a negative sense. And so I'll just calmly say, that's a great question. I'm not sure, right? As a professional researcher, we are not expected to memorize everything. I'll get back to you. I'll look it up on email, send it out, you know, to the entire class, and that's been resolved. If there's lingering questions, you can follow up in the next class. But that tends to reduce, you know, that kind of behavior over time. Where possible, it's great if you can use like the class email function in Blackboard, because when you do that, it's archived on like the announcement page, for instance. So if they have later, they can follow up on that on Blackboard. I do teach my students to avoid use statements if you can. So where possible, especially during peer reviews and group discussions, I say focus on the research, the argument, the data, the article, the sentence. Because when you use the use statement, it just feels like a stab to the heart. Like it really does for them. And because they're so pained by the perceived offense or negativity, they shut down, right? They're not interested anymore. They blank. They either get nervous or they don't want to be there. But when you're trying to work constructively in a discussion or with your writing in a peer setting, kind of detaching from the individual and looking at what's on the page instead can be helpful. I also teach my students to take a breath before speaking and answering. A lot of folks are not comfortable with silence. And so just happened just yesterday in my class, a young woman in my class answered incorrectly. And you could tell her facial expression was mortified, like in class. She just immediately shut down. But I've already established a habit in class where it's okay to take a pause or a breath. And so then she collected herself, looked at her notes, and I'm sure it felt like ages for her, but on the clock, not even 30 seconds, you know. And so then she regrouped, and then what was great was I could then say, okay, she had part of the answer now correct. Who else can help her? What other colleagues, right, can help her? And people stepped up to help her out, right? And so that I think helps to know, okay, silence is not that bad. Just take a deep breath or two or three. If you can, practice distancing oneself from emotional responses, or depending on the situation, address the emotion directly in real time. So an example of this is I've had students do group discussions and then group presentations, and in previous semesters, I've had students just immediately burst into tears in front of the entire class, right? Or a student might be completely frozen like a deer caught in headlights, and like nobody knows what to do. The whole class gets really awkward. And so what I'll do is I'll address the emotion directly in real time. So depending on how far along we are in the semester, I might say, what are you feeling in this moment, right? They typically will take a moment, they'll identify, I'm embarrassed, or I forgot, or I'm nervous, or I don't like this topic, or I don't feel like this is good enough, and then we address it like as an instructor or as a group. There are other times where, how shall I say, this is probably the military brat in me. There are other times where I say a version of suck it up buttercup, right? Where they just, like professionally, like you take your deep breath, and you power forward, right? You just go through, right? The world will not stop for you, right? So I think that's an art and a science, so I can't really tell you what the formula is for that, but I do in my classes also encourage them, like, distance yourself from the emotion, put it in a box or compartmentalize and get through. And students thankfully do that, right? Again, it's not easy, but they're more likely to if you're encouraging them to do that. So the first strategy was modeling professionalism, and the second one is to teach critical thinking. So I recommend that folks define it, give examples, and give opportunities to engage in and practice critical thinking. So whenever I poll my students at the beginning of the semester, I find that the majority of them have heard about critical thinking, but they don't really know what it means. So I'll say, have you heard of this? They're like, yeah, our professors talk about it all the time. When I say, can you give me a definition? They can't really give me a definition. They can't really give me examples either about it. So especially for political science. So I encourage faculty to explain it in general, but also explain it as it pertains to your discipline. And then remind students about what critical thinking is and why it matters and for whom, right? Thankfully, I work in a field where we address current events a lot, so they're able to reference current events and the lack of critical thinking in many ways, right, in the general public or with officials. And so we use current events as a launch pad for that. But I do think it's important to engage in that so that they understand when they're in their group discussions, they need to engage in critical thinking exercises. This isn't just spouting random opinions, for example. So what would that entail, right? How do we do that? Well, I think that critical thinking involves exposing students to listening, logic, and evidence. So you can define active listening and then provide chances to practice it. So students will often get in pairs or in groups, and they'll have these silly exercises where they're engaging in active listening, and they find that they're all terrible at it, right? Then we laugh, right? But then we move on. But it's an idea there to let them get practice with the listening component. I also am a big fan of covering logical fallacies in class within the first 2 weeks, especially fallacies that are connected to the common need or interest in emotional attachments to ideas, values, identity, ideologies, and partisanship. You can Google logical fallacies very easily, and a whole list of 10 plus will come up for folks. And then we, right, and we explain why each of those is important, that manifests itself. And then the funny thing is, students will come back to you and say, I'm seeing them everywhere. My dad just did it, right? Like the dog groomer did it, my other professor did it, I did it, right? Like they start to see them everywhere, which is helpful, right, for their discussions later. I also think it's important to explain different kinds of biases. A few popular examples are things like confirmation bias, where basically you search for or interpret information that confirms your pre-existing beliefs. There might be omitted variable bias, where you're leaving out important variables or factors that could explain a particular situation, as well as groupthink or the bandwagon effect, selection bias, and anchoring bias. The most popular thing that my students are guilty of, and now they know they're guilty of, is using anecdotes or the one personal experience they have to generalize to everybody else, right? So, you know, they'll say, well, my cousin's brother, right, ... or I ... right? And then they think that that's the entire narrative. And then when you show them data and you explain biases, they have an oh no moment, right? Some will still stick to their, you know, stick to their preconceived ideas, but at least exposing them to these kinds of things, I think, will be helpful. Teaching critical thinking, I think, also involves asking questions that could be face-to-face or on paper. So students might say something either in a group or individually to the whole class that doesn't make sense or is completely wrong, right? And in those cases, I ask the student him or herself who made the comments, or other students, to locate the source of that comment or observation and then walk through the logic or the evidence of it. This sometimes means going off script, off your slides, off your original lecture plan, but I think it's an important investment. If you do need to cover certain material or you're short on time, you can go ahead and just bundle it together and you do it for them if you don't have the time to wait for them to correct themselves, right? I also think you can ask students to explore the role of socialization. So the origin and purpose and consequences, for instance, of us versus them type of thinking and behavior. So last fall, I had an issue in my comparative politics class where students were working in groups, and rather than working cooperatively, they were working competitively, not group versus group, but within the group they were competitive, which from an instructor's point of view makes no sense because the group grade is what everybody would get, right? So I had to have an entire lengthy conversation with the group on what's going on, and they said to me that they had been socialized that when you get to college, you're on your own, that's that, right? And you need to get the best grade that you can, and it's competitive, it's a Shark Tank, everybody's out for their own, don't trust anyone. And I was really surprised by, like, who's told you this, right? Coming from. And so ultimately, I said things like, look, it doesn't make sense to be competitive within your own group because at the end of the day, it's one group grade for everybody. And so I said, that doesn't mean you can't be competitive with yourself, right? You can be better like the next time, right? You could also be competitive arguably with Kingsville or Del Mar or other entities, right? I was like, you don't want to completely undo their perspective of American competition, right? Because that's too much for them to handle. So, but yeah, the idea that in the classroom you would be that competitive, I said, nobody gets a higher grade for being the first or the fastest or because your group got left behind and you think that you did it all. So, yeah, it was a strange thing, but asking them, who's socializing you to think this way and act this way. I also think you can ask students who or what is missing. So what's missing on the syllabus, in the readings, in the narrative, et cetera, and why. This also takes some time, but I think it's important for students to be exposed that we're being selective, intentionally or not, with what material we're presenting and how it's being presented. So an example of this is in the field of political science. When I ask my students to think critically about the course syllabi, not just in political science, but across multiple disciplines, I have them look at the syllabus for all their classes, and they'll mention how women experts and women authors are often missing from the readings, whether it's the textbook author or the articles, for example. So this is a good time for me to talk about my own discipline, where I say, okay, this has become such a serious problem that women political scientists decided to come up with a website called Women Also Know Stuff, right? And they list there for political scientists and students and the media scholars who are experts. So when you're writing your syllabi or planning conferences or citing research or giving op-eds and articles, you're not leaving out some key people, for instance. And so when we have this discussion, my students start going back to all their other syllabi, and they're floored, right? And then if you start folding in other things, right, geographic, urban, rural, right, religion, nationality, as well as race and ethnicity, they start to realize that the trend from when they were younger, where their textbooks in middle school or high school might have been biased in certain ways, oh wait, research and more books, even at the advanced level, might also be missing some key components. And so this is a way to show students that there's multiple voices, if you will, that's out there, and so they can be more mindful in their group discussions about diverse voices, and then understand that humans are imperfect, so if in their discussions they're having some flaws, they're not the only ones, right? Like even the whole discipline might be having flaws with stuff like that. And then, of course, just keep asking more questions, right? Ask them to connect material to larger issues or content and methods in the course. I'm going to distinguish between descriptions and analysis, though. So my students often think it's cheesy, but I always go through the who, what, where, when, how, and why. They're like, we learned this in, elementary school. I'm like, I know, but we're not great at it, so we got to keep practicing, right? So who, what, where, and how, and why, and then teaching them what analysis might mean in your own discipline. I also ask students about the similarities and differences between tolerance and acceptance. So part of having civil group discussions is understanding you could tolerate what somebody might be saying, but it doesn't mean that you agree with what they're saying. And students often conflate those two. They kind of think like, oh, if I'm hearing this person out, it must mean I'm agreeing with them, and that's not necessarily the case. I also ask students to check facts in real time. If you allow student phones or student computers or iPads, et cetera, in class, you can have them check facts in real time or on the class computer itself if needed. That can help clarify that who, what, where, when, how, and why. My students, I guess maybe not surprisingly, use the word they a lot, right? They're like, I heard they said, or they did da da da, right? And they use this word they, and so I'll have them go on their phones to find out specifically who said that, right? And specifically where that information came from. And then they're often surprised that they misunderstood who they was, right, from the beginning. So the strategies of modeling professionalism and teaching critical thinking, when you're doing those two strategies, I think there's some extra facilitation notes that might be beneficial. So remember, you can build lesson plans in advance with input from other faculty and or students. There's lots of you in this room today where I've talked with your lesson plans or my lesson plans to figure out if we're going in the right direction, so to speak. Please, where possible, avoid tokenism. And if you engage in it, apologize if it happens. We don't want to cherry pick individual students or cases to be representative of everybody and everything. It can put students in an awkward and sometimes painful or problematic spot to do this. This also happens outside of the classroom as well, amongst us adults too, right? So be mindful of that. If you make a mistake, acknowledge it and then do better in the future. I know a lot of us like to avoid conflict, but it is important to understand that can happen, right? And I have had some students say, via email, I didn't like what you said or how you said that in class, and they're having an emotional reaction to it. And then I'll either email them back or have a conversation during office hours, but I will address it publicly as well so they understand a bit where I'm coming from. So the easiest example of that is students often get uncomfortable in class when I publicly say no. Like, no, like that's wrong. It's like, no, straight, like I have no qualms about saying no, that is incorrect. And it's a disservice for me as an expert in my field to say, oh, let's work through that. Like, no, like it's wrong, and here's why it's wrong, right? But that can make them feel uncomfortable and stressed out, and a lot of them are not used to being told no, or that they're wrong, or that was problematic or offensive in some way. So just being mindful that it's okay, right, to be honest. But if you do make a legitimate mistake, then of course acknowledge it and then do better. When you are staging an intervention of some kind, name the issue and address it directly. Some folks, there might be a situation in class where a student might say something that's really problematic, offensive, and I've done this in the past too, where I just ignored it and went on, right? I've learned now that I actually, for my classes at least, it's important to name the issue, address it directly in some fashion, because otherwise it left it hanging in the air, and then nobody is paying attention to anything else that you're saying or doing in the rest of the class. So I have had to name the issue and address it directly. So, the most prominent example of that in my classes is whenever we talk about things like affirmative action, or when we talk about social welfare programs, for example. On those two topics, students are very biased, right? And unfortunately, the most under or ill-informed about those two particular topics. Inevitably somebody will say, I went to H-E-B yesterday and I saw somebody using food stamps on Snickers bars and booze, and I'm like, okay, hold on, right? We got to talk through those particular concerns. So name the issue, address it directly. It does not mean the whole class has to be derailed, though, for that one commenter person, because I don't think it's fair to the rest of the class to shift everything towards that one person who either made a scene or said the problematic comments in some way. That's giving the stage and privilege to that particular student in that case. So if you've sufficiently addressed it, just go ahead and move on. You may need to follow up, but don't spend the rest of the class trying to persuade or justify for that particular student. Some more notes on facilitation. Where appropriate, time limits on the topic, the discussion, or intervention, right? Just as I said, don't let it go on for too long. Allow short breaks if time permits them. Sometimes when I show a particularly difficult video clip, or we've just had a topic that's pretty intense, I'll give students a short break. Sometimes it's a bathroom break or something to get a drink or a snack, but something that they can decompress just a little bit before we launch into a lengthier discussion. Follow up later in person by email or in a handout if you need to. And then, Kelly, how am I doing on time? Am I okay? Okay. And then I think something that's really important is making small steps towards building human connections. So that might sound a little fluffy, but what I mean by that is a lot of times facilitating civil group discussions will go better when students have more empathy and they understand a bit more where other people are coming from, okay? So I thought we could do a quick little exercise to give you an example of what I do at the start of the year that helps throughout the semester because there's some humanity, right, that's there. So the example I wanted to give today with you all is a little icebreaker that I call, what's the history of your name? I find that civil group discussions are more civil when you have good foundations, and those good foundations are if you have some empathy about where somebody is coming from, right? So how about with the person sitting next to you, okay, if you could just briefly explain the history of your name. It could be your first name, your middle name, your last name, or your title, right? If you don't know the history, that's totally okay, but maybe talk about why you don't know the history of your name. And then we'll debrief as a group, okay? So with somebody sitting next to you, how on earth and where did your name come from? Okay, so why don't we go ahead and regroup? So did you learn a little bit about maybe each other's traditions or cultures or family family? You'll So one thing that I like about this is it can be meaningful because a lot of folks don't ever get a chance to talk about their name or where they're from, right? And you can do this in any class, and inevitably the students will make some kind of connection. And then what I typically do is I will poll students afterwards. So I'll say, okay, which students were named after somebody special, right? And inevitably they'll raise their hands, and it'll be after a grandparent or, somebody, like their dad's best friend or somebody that had, had a legacy of some kind. I'll say, okay, well, how many, folks were, named after somebody from the movies or literature, right? And then, you'll find out there's a surprising number of your students who were named after the Friends TV show characters. Like, I had no idea. And I was like, wow, okay, that was new to me, right? That showed the age difference there. There might be some lineage stuff as well, One thing students will talk about is some students will have both an American or an Americanized name or nickname versus their traditional or given name, for instance, and we talk about the politics behind that. Students might have been named after different leaders, for instance. So it's an interesting way to kind of get at different topics depending on what your interest is with them. And one thing that I think is helpful is when students just know that little bit extra, like that little bit of extra humanity behind that other person, they're more likely to be civil to them because they're like, oh, right, like that's so-and-so. They remember the name of that person much easier. Sometimes we do it throughout the semester if it's a large class so that they can get experience with lots of different people, for instance. And so at least for me, I find that type of exercise is more productive than what was the last book you read, because none of my students read, unfortunately. Or if I'll say, like, what did you do last summer? They don't want to talk about what they did last summer. So, at least this is already a ready-made topic. And the really cool thing is this brings the civil group discussions back home. So a lot of my students will later come back and say, you got me thinking, I asked my dad about such and such, or I asked my sister about such and such. And I think that's kind of cool that they start learning a little bit more. And then when they know a bit more about the history, they can connect to at least some of the content that you're talking about. Because at least for my field, history is really important. So they're like, oh, wait, if I'm a third generation Texan, like what does that mean regarding Mexico and the border, right? Like they start making connections because inherently their name is there. And then because I'm a political scientist, I'll inevitably say something about your thing or you don't care about politics because politics is embedded in your name. And they're like, oh, because it is, right? And then if you feel comfortable, you can tell them your name history too, because a lot of times they'll be curious about that. And then you can address stereotypes, for instance, if you want to extend it. So just one small example of that. So I know we don't have a ton of time, but if you happen to have any questions for me, I might be happy to. Yeah, Gabriel.
In this time of really high have any kind of situation in which some students talk kind of a matter of policy, like
Yeah, okay, perfect. So Sarah's question is, okay, in this highly partisan times, right? Effectively, like, do you have a Trump supporter versus a not Trump supporter? Right? Okay, in some. Okay, yes, absolutely, absolutely, particularly given the region that we're in, right? So, you know, and I benefit from the fact of being in political science and in international relations, so like there's loads of history and it's in the book that this is not new, right? So the first thing I say is the arguments or concerns you're presenting are actually not new, okay? That kind of dampens it a little bit, right? Because they get really emotionally connected, you know, to those folks. So I tell them, okay, deep breath, because what will happen is those two will start to go at it, and then the rest of the class deflates. Like they're rolling their eyes, they're like hunched over, they go on their phone. They're just deeply unhappy about this situation. So what I'll do is I will, like I had mentioned before, ask them the source of their information, right? So where are both sides getting their information? Now, usually it stops right there because both will immediately, like, they don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they don't know. Like, they'll be like, well, I heard this, or I read this, or I saw this. And then when we try to check the facts on the phones or online, or when I have them try to disentangle it, they don't know. And so then both arguments fall completely apart. But I try to help salvage them by saying, okay, here's where it might be from, right? And then here's what is actually going on in these scenarios. And then I try to find a way for them to, where possible, both personally relate to the issue in some fashion. So if you ask them why, like why is this so stressful, or why are you saying this comment, a lot of times it will come down to because it impacts their family in some way. So then if you find that common ground, you can play off of those shared political values or shared priorities, but it's not easy, and it's not fun when that happens. If you don't want to spend too much class time on it, you can have them, you can acknowledge what they've said and say, those are really interesting points. Okay, can you prepare some further comments next class, right? Then that gives them some time to write things down or type things out on paper, come to next class. So you're still showing that you care about what they've said, and then maybe when they've thought a little bit about it or researched a bit and they come to the next class, when you, like if there's something, then you should be responsible as well for following up. I mean, that's my perspective for students. If it's particularly offensive, I will shut it down though. So I mean, if it's completely wrong, I will say no, that's incorrect, and then I'll go to the internet and put resources to counter whatever that particular person said. So is that embarrassing for the student? Probably. Are they unhappy about it? Yeah. But it's my role to say, hey, that information is not correct. It also is helpful if you include some history on, okay, so, you know, there's stereotypes about previous presidents, and so I'll say, okay, you know, think Trump is great. Here are what other presidents did, Republican and Democrat, right? Here's how this compares or not. I have the comparative advantage of referencing other, you know, other countries, for instance, and you could too. You know, you could give plenty of Mexico examples as well. But yeah, it'll happen, especially right now. Yeah. Other. Okay. Thank you so much. Good. Feel free to be in touch. I know you all have to get going, so.